Okay, so now we're ready to really apply matrices to a systems of equations using this example that we have here. Here I have three equations with three unknowns, and I'm going to try to solve this system using matrices. The first thing I want to do is I want to create the augmented matrix, and so this matrix this time is going to have 3 rows in it. Now the first row comes from the first equation, so it's the coefficients of both of x, y, and z. So 1, -1, 1, and then also what it's equal to, 8. Moving on to the second row in this, we have 2, 3, -1, -2, and the final row is 3, -2, -9, 9. And so again, the 3 leftmost columns are the variable columns, so they're going to stand for my x's, my y's, and my z's, and the rightmost column is this answer. I do want to take just a second and point out to you that if you have an equation that, let's say, doesn't have a variable, let's pretend that this last equation was just 3x minus 9z. So we're missing the y variable in that particular equation in my scenario. You would still represent that slot in this row by just representing it with a 0. In other words, you need the 0 to be in the matrices as kind of a placeholder. So just be aware that that may be the case sometime. Now, in order to solve this, what do we want to do? We want to get 1s along the diagonal. So in this first position, this is always where you start. Top right, top left-hand corner should always be a 1. Well, lucky for us, it is. So now we can move on to getting zeros below that. I need a 0 in this position and a 0 in this position. In order to get zeros, that's when we usually do the multiply and add operation in order to turn this into a 0. Now remember, when we multiply and add, we are doing it to the row we want to change. I want to change this row right here, row number 2, and I want this position here to be a 0. And I'm going to be adding to that position. So if I were to multiply row number 1 by a -2 and add it to row number 2, I would get a 0 in that position. So that's what we're going to do. -2 times row number 1 plus row number 2 gives me a new row number 2. So that's what we're going to do for row 2. We can do the same thing in row number 3 here. Again, I need to keep row number 1 the way it is because I like this 1 in that position. So I'm going to multiply row number 1 by -3. So -3 plus 3 would be 0. So if I were to multiply by -3, multiply -3 times row 1, add it to row number 3, I'm going to end up with a new row 3. These are the operations that we're going to do, only this time we are going to let our calculator do this part for us. But you do want to be writing down what the operations are below your matrices so you know what to do when you put it in the calculator. So how do we do this in the calculator? Well, the first thing that we're going to do is we have to go to the matrix screen, and you're going to find that by doing second inverse x, and you'll see matrix is written above there. I'm going to put this in, and I'm going to be editing basically a matrix. So I'm going to arrow over until I get to edit. And I'm just going to choose option number 1 because it's the easiest. Even though I already have information here in this matrix, I can edit it I type right over it. So it's number 1 I'm choosing. Now this matrix, you can kind of see on my calculator, is a 2 by 2 matrices. And it's listed in rows and columns. So it's 2 rows by 2 columns. Well, the matrix that I am working on over here on the left, my augmented matrix, is 3 rows by 4 columns. So I want this to say 3 by 4. And I just hit enter every single time. And you can see that it expanded my matrix to where I have 3 rows and 4 columns. I'm just going to fill this in as I move across the top by putting the numbers that are in my matrix over here. So I have 1, -1, and each time I hit enter to move it to the next position, 1, 8, and it just goes down to the next row. 2, 3, -1, Oops, not negative 2. Let's see. Let's go back a little. Negative 1. Let's see if that works for me. Nope, still not. There we go. Negative 1 and negative 2. Enter. I've got 3, negative 2, negative 9, and 9. Let me just take a second and look over that and make sure I didn't miss anything. Okay, so this is the matrix that I'm going to be performing operations on. As soon as I perform one operation on matrix A, it's going to change matrix A within my calculator. So you need to be aware of that. In order for me to do any operations though, I have to quit this and go back to the home screen. So I'm going to hit second, quit, and I'm back here. In other words, I had to get out of that editing position. Now, what do I want to do? I want to perform some operations on that matrix. So I'm going to go back into my matrix menu by hitting second, X inverse, and this time I'm going to perform some math on my matrix. So I arrow over to math. Now, all of the operations that we are looking for, those 3 that we've been talking about, are at the bottom of this list. So I'm just going to arrow up. These last 4, I would say, these last 4, C, D, E, and F, are the row operations that we are going to be concerned with right now. Now, what am I doing here in this first option? Over here on my matrix, I am multiplying by a row and adding it to another row. If that's the case, then I'm going to choose option F that's already highlighted here, because notice it's got an asterisk indicating multiplication, times a row, and then an addition sign. So that's the operation I'm going to choose, and I'm going to hit enter to choose it. So I'm back on the home screen, and it's waiting for me, the calculator's waiting for me to tell it, well, what do you want me to perform this operation on? Well, the first thing I'm going to enter is the multiplication part. What am I going to be multiplying by? According to my operation over here, I'm going to multiply by a negative 2. So negative 2, comma. The next thing I'm going to enter is the matrix that I'm talking about. So you have to tell the calculator which matrix you were referring to. So I'm going to go back to second matrix, and this is where I choose option number 1 under names, because that was the matrix that I put all of my stuff into to begin with. So number 1, and see, it put in brackets matrix A for me right here. I got to put another comma, because what am I multiplying by in matrix A? Well, I'm going to multiply negative 2, and I'm applying that to row number 1. That's where the 1 comes in. And then I'm going to add that to row number 2. So in this string of commands, I'm telling the calculator to multiply negative 2 on row number 1 in matrix A and add that to row number 2. When I hit enter, you'll see that it brings up a new matrix here on my screen. And what it did is it multiplied negative 2 times row number 1, added it to row number 2, and we ended up with a new row 2 here. Now I'm going to go back in and I'm going to do the same thing, only I'm for row number 3, but I'm going to do it to this matrix right here. This is where you have to keep up with what it is that you're multiplying. So I still want to do that same multiply and add command. So I'm going to do second matrix. I'm going to arrow over to math, and I'm going to arrow up to the last option there and hit enter. So I'm going to multiply negative 3. Only this time, what matrix am I doing that to? Well, I'm doing it to this matrix that you see up here. So I'm going to do second, and then its answer, or this negative sign at the bottom. So it's telling the calculator, go pull the answer that you see above what your previous answer and perform this operation on it. So again, what row do I want to do this to? I want to multiply by on row 1, and I'm going to add it to row number 3. Close my parentheses, and there is my new matrix. So I'm going to write that down on our paper over here, and then we'll see what we're going to do next. Now this is the matrix right here that we just had our calculator find for us. And remember that we're trying to get ones along the diagonal here. Well, I already have, so the next one that I want to get would be in this position here. If you notice, I already have a 1 in that second position in the third row. So what if I just switch these two rows? Let's do a row swap. Let's switch row number 2 with row number 1. I mean, not row number 1, row number 3, because it's the second and the third. And we're going to do that on our calculator. So I pull it back up, and I'm going to go back to that second matrix, arrow over to math, arrow up, and I'm down at the bottom. Now this is a row swap, so I'm going to choose option number C by arrowing up to it, hit enter, and I'm back on the home screen. So it's asking me, well, what do you want to swap? Well, I want to swap rows 2 and 3 from the matrix that we have on our calculator screen right there. So I'm going to say no, that's not what I want to say. I got to go back and get my row up one more time. Let's try that again. I want to arrow over, and I want letter C because I'm doing a row swap. And I want a row swap in the matrix that you see there. So I'm going to hit second answer, and I want to swap row 2 with row 3. Close my parentheses, enter. Now notice the matrix that shows up just switched rows 2 and 3. Now at this point, I still have several more lines of operations to perform in my calculator. And if I mess up on any of these commands like I almost did a minute ago, I can't refer back to my previous answer in the calculator. So if you want to kind of save your work at this point, we can store this matrix as it is. So to do that, I'm going to do store, and where do I want to store it? I want to store it in matrix. In case I mess up, I'm going to store it as matrix B. That way I don't have to re-enter matrix A. So I'm going to hit enter, and I'm going to hit enter. So all it did is I'm now going to start referring to the matrix that I'm using as matrix B. It just saved my work is all I did. Okay, so I'm going to copy this matrix down, and we'll see what our next step in these row operations needs to be. So here I have the matrix that we just found in the calculator copied onto my paper. Again, I have zeros working along the diagonal. Every time I get a 0, the next thing I want to, I mean not zeros, every time I get ones in the diagonal, my next step ought to be to get a 0 underneath and then above it. So what am I going to do here? If I want to turn this into a 0, every time in the past, in order to turn something into a 0, we multiply and add to the row I want to change. So it's this row that I'm going to be adding to. Now which one of these rows do I use? Well, I want to use this row, row number 2. This is the row I'm going to multiply a number 2 and add to change to row number 3. The reason I chose that is because this 0 added to this 0 just gives me 0. If I chose row number 1 to add to row number 3, then 1 plus 0 gives me a 1 in that position, and I worked really hard to get zeros here. So I want to leave zeros in this position. That's how come I'm going to multiply -5 times row number 2, add that to row number 3, and I'm going to end up with a new row 3. This is what we are going to do on the calculator. So I'm going to do second matrix, arrow over and up. So I'm multiplying and adding, so that is the option that's down there at the bottom, or option F, and I hit enter. I am going to multiply a -5, and I'm going to do that to the matrix above. So I can still hit second answer, but I at least have this matrix here saved, so if I mess it up, then we're not too far out here. So I'm going to multiply -5 times row number 2 in that matrix, and I'm going to add it to row number 3. Hit enter, and now we have this matrix here. So notice I have a 0 in the position that I needed it to be in row number 3. Okay, so we're back here. We have ones so far in the diagonal right there, and I have zeros underneath them. Now the last one that I need to get is in this position here. Anytime I want to get a 1 in this single row is where I'm going to multiply that row by the reciprocal of this value. So this is going to be 1 over 57 times row 3, giving me the new row 3. And again, we're going to do that on the calculator. So if I pull the calculator up, I want to do second matrix. I'm going to arrow over and up. Now I am just doing a straight multiplication. So that option is letter E. I'm going to multiply by a row. So I'm going to choose enter there. And I'm going to multiply by 1 over 57. And I'm going to do that to that matrix above. And I'm going to do it to row number 3. I had to think about what row we were doing this to. So I'm going to do it to row number 3. Close my parentheses, hit enter, and now I have ones in the diagonal. So I'm going to copy that matrix down. Okay, so here we are again. I have ones on the diagonal and I have zeros below. So we're going to go back now and we need to get zeros above. These are the next positions that I'm going to look at as turning zeros into those spots. This procedure is going to be exactly like it was when I started. Remember, I started over here with a 1 and I wanted to get zeros below it. Well, it's the same concept, only we're kind of going backwards. So I am going to be getting zeros here in row number 2 and row number 1. And I'm going to use row number 3 in order to get it. So what would I multiply then row number 3 by, adding to row number 2? Well, I'm going to multiply positive 12 times row number 3, add it to row number 2 to give me a new row 2. Now I do the next one. What would I multiply 1 by, adding it to this to give me a 0? And that's just a negative. So I'm going to say -1 times row 3, adding it to row 1 gives me a new row 1. These are the operations that we're going to use in the in our calculator. So we're going to pull it up and I'm going to perform those operations. So we'll do second matrix, arrow over to math, arrow up to option F, and I'm going to start with 12, and I'm going to do this to the previous answer, so second answer. Now you can save at any point along here by storing. I just haven't done it. I'm going to do that to row number 3, and I'm going to add it to row number 2. Now I keep glancing over here at my commands that we wrote on so that I know how to enter this into the So I hit enter and you can see that I have a 0 up here. I'm going to do that one more time to row number 2. So I hit second matrix, arrow over to math, arrow up to the bottom, and I want to multiply by a -1 into that matrix we just messed with, so into the previous answer. I'm going to do that to row number 3, and I'm going to add it to row number 1. And there we go. I have zeros above that 1 that I wanted, and I'm going to write that on the paper now. Okay, we're almost done. We have ones along the diagonal. I have zeros here and I have zeros here. This is the last place I need a 0 to be. So again, whenever I want a 0, I multiply and add. I am going to multiply row 2 by something, adding it to row number 1, because it's row number 1 that I want to change. And I chose row number 2 because of the position of what I want to get rid of. If I multiplied row number 3 by some number, adding it to row number 1, I'm not going to get a 0 here. Okay, so that's how I know to choose row number 2. So if I don't even have to multiply, I can just add these two together, because 1 plus a negative 1. So if I do row number 2 plus row number 1 is going to give me a new row number 1. That's the command we're going to use in the calculator. So, second matrix, arrow over, arrow up, and let's just add. That's choosing option D. I'm going to add the two rows together. Okay, I went and stored the matrix one more time just because I don't want to get this command wrong and then have to start all over. So that's where the extra line is there. So I'm going to choose to reference the matrix above, and I'm going to tell it that I want to add row 2 to row number 1. So I'm going to hit a 2 and a 1 and cross my fingers that I got the commands in there right. Yes, I did. Okay, so I've got the 1s along the diagonal, 0s above and below. Now this is what it looks like right here. So this is the matrix that we just found using the commands on our calculator. Notice again, I have 1s along the diagonal. I have 0s above and below. The only thing that remains is this part right here. The only numbers that remains are these numbers in this last column. And those are the answers to the problem. Those are the solution to the matrix. So this says that x is equal to 4, y is equal to negative 3, and z is equal to a negative 1. And that's the answer to this systems of equations that we started out using with 3 equations and 3 unknowns using matrices. Now, if you don't remember the commands that we were using in your calculator, then I have provided for you a printout that I found just off of the internet, and it's got all of the commands that I was using in the calculator that you can see there. I think if you were to just go through it step by step with me in the video, you should be able to follow along.